in the booklet, and that is step 6, the action plan that the students have deemed as their most important solution. And I always find this step very exciting to read because it's a real culmination of their process, and they're very creative many times in how they devise their action plan, and you get a really complete picture of the thought process that the students went through to come to the conclusion that this was going to be their very best solution. So in this step, the students choose their highest scoring solution, explain its relevance and importance to the future scene and the underlying problem. It's written in a narrative form, and it's evaluated on several aspects. The first aspect is relevance. We then have effectiveness, criteria that they've used to develop their action plan, the impact that this action plan has, the humaneness of this action plan, and the development of the action plan. The first thing that we will do is just take a look at the synopsis of all of the points that are possible for each of these aspects, and then we will look in depth at exactly what each aspect measures and the types of scores that are awarded to students on the rubric. So the relevance is the connection of the action plan back all the way to step 2 for that underlying problem. Students can earn up to 5 points for this. The effectiveness, how effective is the action plan to that underlying problem, is up to 5 points. The criteria takes a look at the evidence that the students used in developing their criteria to measure the solutions and how that was used in their action plan. Again, that is up to 5 points. The impact is the degree of the action plan's impact on the future scene. We have humaneness. Of course, we want to create positive futures. That's part of our FPSPI mission statement. So it is very important that students choose a positive and productive potential in their action plan. And this is where this is scored. You may notice throughout the booklet that they might have included some solutions that weren't quite humane, but we weren't evaluating for that at the time. But now is the time that we would look for that positive and productive aspect. And if students chose things that weren't quite positive, we would mark them down in this aspect. And then lastly, you'll notice this is weighted the heaviest, up to 10 points for here. This is the explanation that the students provide. This is the in-depth written work that they provide so that we can get a clear picture of what they are aiming to do with their action plan. Now we'll take a close look at each of these aspects. So the relevance aspect is going to look at the process. How does the process of this plan, what we're going to do, what the students say they're going to complete, how well does it respond to the key verb phrase, and how well does it respond to the purpose? And those are those two important aspects in step 2. Here is the rubric piece of the score sheet. If the action plan has an excellent relationship to the underlying problem, that would be awarded the highest points of 5. Going down the scale, if it does a good job, would be a 4. If it has some relation to the UP or another solution might have been better, you would assign that a 2 or 3. If it doesn't address the underlying problem at all, those students would be awarded 1 point. Okay. Any questions here on relevance? No. Okay. Taking a look at the next aspect of our scoring, and that's effectiveness. And the effectiveness measures the potential success of the action plan in relation to the goals stated in the underlying problem. Does it actually solve the key verb phrase, and does it fulfill the purpose? So you may think that that looks very similar to what we were looking for in relevance, but relevance is, does it respond to it? The effectiveness is, does it actually do the action that we say it's going to do? So does it truly solve the key verb phrase, and does it fulfill that purpose? If the action plan completely solves the underlying problem, that would score the highest at 5 points. If it's an adequate solution, 4. If it solves some aspects, a 2 or a 3. And if it does little to solve the underlying problem, it only scores a 1 at this point. Next, we take a look at the criteria as it's used in the action plan. Do the students integrate the criteria in the description of their plan? So for example, do they talk about the kinds of things they measured the solutions against each other and how this winning solution was deemed to be the highest one? Did criteria play a role in their decision-making progress, and how do they address that in their plan? If they address the criteria in a convincing manner, that would be up to 5 points. Some valid connections would be 4. If the criteria is minimal or unclear, that would be a 2 or a 3. If it doesn't address the criteria at all, that would result in the score of a 1. Now, it is important to note that students shouldn't stop here in their action plan and explain how they wrote and chose all of those criteria and how they measured each of the solutions against them. But it should be clear that the criteria was used in their decision-making process, and perhaps how a few of those criteria were utilized in selecting the winning solution. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the impact. That is the strength of the effect of the action plan on that future scene. This is connected back to the adequacy score that was awarded to the students in step 2. If the underlying problem adequacy has a stronger score, it's going to result in a stronger score here. And it determines that the action plan will make the future scene better for the stakeholders that were mentioned in that action plan. So if you scored very high in step 2, you're going to score very high on impact based on that adequacy score. So this is a reference back to step 2, a little different here. Any questions on the last few slides that we've covered?
So when you're measuring the impact score, is there any way that their action plan will get a 5 if they had 4 scores on step 2?
Not the impact section. So if they had an adequacy score of 4 or 5, you would not award them 5 points here. Okay, if they had a 9 or a 10 in adequacy in step 2, that would result in 5 points here.
On the impact part.
On the impact part, that is correct. That was a good question. That's the first time we've done this in the booklet evaluation so far, looking back at how another step was scored. So that was a good question to ask. Okay, humaneness. This is that productive, positive potential of the action plan. This is scored independently of its relationship to the underlying problem, and this should look at the practical consequences of implementing this plan. If in the solution of de-extinction from the international conference, if students were to allow all of the animals that were brought back from extinction to kill off and gobble up all of the existing animals and treat them poorly, that could be considered inhumane because then it would deem that the plan is destructive. And that would result in a lower score. If the plan is positive and constructive, it would earn the highest points of 5. In between there, if you saw that constructive potential, that could earn a 4. And lastly, we take a look at the development of the action plan. How well do the students elaborate and explain all of the things they're doing? Is there a blueprint to execute the action plan? Do we know who's going to help the team solve this problem? Who might resist the team? How they might overcome those limitations? It is a well-developed version of that step 3 solution. It's a blueprint. It's exactly how they're going to execute it. They might list some timelines in there, what they're going to do first, what they're going to hope to achieve after some time has passed. So that sort of narrative of a timeline is very important to include also. So if it is well structured, if it's detailed more than the who, what, where, when, why, and how, it scores a 9 or 10. If it explains those elements in detail, a 7 or 8. If you feel yourself as an evaluator wondering, how is this going to work out? Or who are they going to get to help support them on this? Or, wow, they have a lot of things in their plan, but I'm not quite sure what they're going to do first or how long the other items are going to take. You feel yourself asking these questions, then you surely needed more support of ideas, and that would score in the 4, 5, 6 range. If the students really provide very little elaboration beyond that step 3 solution, they're going to score in the lower 1, 2, or 3 range. You may notice that there has not been any points awarded for paragraphs or grammar or anything like that. It's hard when you look at step 6. It does look like it is part of a narrative or a story. It does not have to be written in paragraphs. We've seen very well developed action plans that fill 2 pages and don't have the start or a stop of 1 paragraph at all. That is hard for some educators or coaches to get past, because we kind of look for that when we see a lot of writing all together, but that is not required, and I do like to make note of that. Okay. So in summary, the development of that plan should elaborate on all of these who, what, where, why, how, and when. So in step 3, we really only asked that they elaborate on 3 of those, but in step 6, we are looking for the development of all of those. Okay. Any questions so far?
So when you say that the paragraphing doesn't count, etc., so then can they include drawings and charts if they explain what's going on?
Excellent question. They can bullet out information, but they are also provided with another page that's not scored as the narrative, where they can draw diagrams or illustrations to support that written piece as well. And you'll see a variety of formats in the action plan. Sometimes students will look for the main stakeholders in the future scene, and they will write a letter to those people, or they might write a holographic message that would be coming through, or it might simply be an outline narrative blueprint type response. And there's a lot of variety that comes out in this step, and you'll see a lot of creative aspects from the students. So some concerns that students encounter is reflected in their scoring of their action plans. If they present 2 solutions that are very different, and they ultimately have 2 smaller plans that are presented, that's very difficult to evaluate, because there's not enough time or space to really fully develop both of those plans. If the action plan is unrelated to the underlying problem, that results in some concern and lack of points for the students. If that action plan goes well beyond the future scene and encompasses a scope larger, broader of that future scene and stakeholders beyond that, that is very detrimental to the team's success. If the underlying problem had a purpose that was omitted, it is very difficult for the students to score high here. If their underlying problem was scored as circular, that does also impact their step 6 score. So in review, we take a look at the relevance of step 6. How does it respond to the underlying problem? The effectiveness, does it actually solve the underlying problem? We look at the criteria, was it incorporated into the action plan? The impact, does that impact the future scene? And remember, that's the one that references back to step 2's adequacy score. We look at the humaneness, taking a look at the positive potential, and then that well-developed and elaborated action plan.
I do have a question on the development score.
Yes.
You had mentioned that sometimes they end up developing 2 to put it in the action plan.
Yes.
You suggest we only look at the first one that they give, or should we consider them together?
Well, sometimes students have been coached because it is appropriate at times to include like solutions together. So you might have your winning solution, and then that winning solution might be expanded on using some other solution ideas. So we want to be careful by just saying yes or no to things, because it is a strategy that at times solutions that weren't chosen as the winning ones could actually support and enhance a like solution. We would, though, however, if the winning solution noted on the grid in step 5, if that one was not actually utilized in the action plan, if it received the most points in step 5, and then the team used a different one in step 6, we would at that point need to go back to step 5 and reduce the points that the team had earned for that step. Okay. So after we've completed step 6, we were going to take a look at those 3 overall aspects that we've looked for holistically while we've been evaluating the entire 6 steps that the students have completed. And this just takes a look at the creative problem solving process from start to finish. From the students' first work in identifying those challenges, analyzing those facts from the future scene, all the way through the development and creation of that action plan. So we're going to take a look at their research that they've applied, their creative strength that they employed throughout the process, their futuristic thinking, and then we're going to provide some overall feedback to the students. So the first thing we take a look at is the research. This is how the students weave all of these researched items throughout their booklet. We don't encourage students to say, according to research, or I read in the US News and World Report that this happened, or I watched a video on BBN. They don't have to quote it exactly, but that research is going to naturally be infused in their writing, and you will see that as evidence throughout. They might use some vocabulary from the topic information. They might know about and reference issues and trends. And we also want to make sure that we do consider the age level of the students, that we make sure that if we are evaluating senior students in 11th and 12th grade, that their level of research would not be the same level of research that we would consider for our younger students in 4th, 5th, or 6th grade. Okay. Of course, the highest scores of 9 or 10 are going to be where that research is evident throughout. It's very thorough. They're able to express their thoughts. They're aware of future trends, vocabulary. It's readily apparent. It's so woven into their challenges and their solutions and their action plan that it's almost like you don't even notice it, but you feel the topic and everything they're writing. If there's a few of those items, we're in the 7-8. If there's minimal evidence, that would score the lowest down at 1, 2, or 3 points. Many evaluators find it helpful to just keep a little jotted notepad next to them. Maybe if they've read through all the challenges and they don't note any research at all, they might just make a little note. And then as they're reading through step 3 and they note a lot of it, that way they can really gauge that holistic piece. Because certainly if there's not a lot of research noted in a step that has 16 challenges, that would impact their research score. Creative strength takes a look at the creativity and the thinking that the students provide through the process. Did they skillfully use the problem-solving process? Did they have high scores for fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration? Because those higher scores are many times what is used in creativity assessments. If you're familiar with the Torrance test for creative thinking, which is the most widely used creativity test around the globe, you will be very familiar with the terms fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration, because those are indicators of creative strength, and that's the model we follow when looking at our assessment practices. We also look for those intellectual energies so that there's those mental leaps. So maybe if a group read some research on different scientific practices and then they read the future scene and it was similar but a little different, and they were able to make that connection, make that leap, and apply that research to the new situation, that really demonstrates creativity also. So the highest scores of 9 and 10 are where we see the strong display of inventive ideas throughout the whole booklet. So we want to be able to see those items in most all steps. If there's innovative thinking and parts of the booklet are going beyond ordinary, that's where they're going to score in the range of 7 and 8. If you're not seeing any evidence at all of critical thinking, that's going to score lower in the 1, 2, and 3. We don't see those scores as much in future problem solving because the process itself goes through the steps in a way that step 1 is very creative with your divergent thinking, and then step 2 requires the students to focus and apply that convergent thinking. Step 3 again is that stage where they're generating and coming up with lots of ideas. So the process itself lends to creative thinking. So we very rarely see scores in the 1, 2, 3, 4 range because of the natural experience that the students have within the process. Any questions so far before we move on to futuristic thinking?
Nope, I think we're good.
Okay, great. All right, so we want to make sure when we're taking a look at the overall score for futuristic thinking that the students themselves are putting themselves in the time frame of that future scene, and they can take current concepts and they can use forward thinking to apply what they've learned currently into the future, and that should be a very natural fit. Technologies, kids are great at indicating a lot of the technological items that maybe different generations that our evaluators are in might not be as second nature to us. Noticing trends is something that is easy for students. The societal responses to actions, sometimes that's where we see that with our more mature teams, not only in age but also in experience, to really take a look at how decisions and items are going to impact the future. So those highest scores are reserved for that excellent use of futuristic concepts and how the items that are identified throughout the problem-solving process will really impact the future society in that future scene. If they're just average futuristic ideas for the age group, that's where they're going to score the 4, 5, and 6. Minimal evidence of those futuristic trends or technologies would score in the 1, 2, and 3. It is important when you are evaluating the futuristic aspect of the booklet that you don't award a lot of points if the students have just sprinkled in technological gadgets. So if they're mentioning holo chats, or they're mentioning VR, virtual reality, but they're not actually infusing that into their solutions or into their action plan, that's not going to score as high as those students who are making meaningful application to the futuristic thinking within what they're solving. So as a review on overall, we look for the research that's applied, up to 10 points there. We look for the creative strength, up to 10 points there. We look for futuristic thinking, up to 10 points there. And we want to provide, again, feedback on their strengths and on their improvements that can be made. These overall aspects, while it's important for evaluators to familiarize themselves with the research on the topics, assessing overall and providing the input that the students are looking for futuristic thinking, research applied, creative strength, is easier for evaluators to identify this if they themselves have familiarized themselves with the topic. So this is a good place to point out that make sure you do your research so that you can provide the best feedback to the students. Okay, that brings us to the conclusion of the booklet. If you've completed a booklet after assessing your overall, you're probably feeling a little tired, but probably feeling very proud of the students and the hope that they give us for the future through their process. So unless there's any questions, that is the completion of the evaluator training.